Okay. It looks like we are recording. And so let's get started with our first speaker. And I'm going to call on Renee Holland. And Renee is a area agent, a blueberry agent from Georgia. And she's going to talk about pruning blueberries and associated plant diseases. And so without further ado, Renee, I'm going to let you talk a little bit, introduce yourself, and then you can get into your presentation.
Okay, thank you so much for having me here today, Dr. Stafne. As he said, I'm Renee Holland. I'm the area blueberry agent for University of Georgia Extension. Basically, it's kind of like a local county extension agent, except I'm specialized. I focus just on commercial blueberry production. And instead of being contained into one county, I'm area wide. I also manage the Blueberry Research and Demonstration Farm. It's a county blueberry research farm here in Bacon County as well, and do all the typical extension agent type events too. But today I'm going to talk to you about pruning blueberries and associated plant diseases. Again, thank you so much for having me here today. Try to get these slides to progress. Oh, too fast. Okay. So for this audience, most of you are probably blueberry growers and already know what species of blueberries you grow. I'm going to try to focus on rabbit eye today, but I may mention southern highbush from time to time. And for any extra people in the audience that are not blueberry producers, just a quick reminder, blueberries are a perennial woody shrub. They produce those nice indigo colored berries that we like for all their health benefits. And they are members of the Ericaceae family. So that's important to remember because those types of plants do well in acidic, infertile soil. For us here in Georgia, we're near the Okefenokee Swamp, where a lot of our commercial production is near that swamp. And we have acidic, infertile soil here in this area. And so blueberry's been a nice crop to replace tobacco back when the tobacco buyout happened back in the early 2000s. So we are thankful for this crop and the socioeconomic impact it's having in our state. And just to orient the Mississippi growers, for us, rabbit eye in Georgia usually starts maturing in terms of ripening probably mid-May at the earliest and goes through June. June is the primary time. And then also we spill over into July at times and have also been harvesting through mid-July in some years. So it kind of varies with the weather and how long our season is depending on the weather. What can pruning do for you? Why do we want to prune? It helps develop the proper shape and form of the plant. It can also help ensure good fruit quality. I'm going to talk about that a good bit today in terms of what we're shooting for with the pruning strategy to ensure good fruit quality. It can also help enhance longevity of the plant. So if you do not prune the plant or hedge the plant ever, you'll continue to get, the canes will age and become unproductive in their fruit production. So you want to enhance longevity, keep younger canes coming up and on through and letting older canes mature. But at the same time, those canes that become much older and less productive, you want to make sure you're rotating those out of the bush. Also, it helps minimize damage and disease. You can cut out diseased tissue and damaged tissue from the harvesters. So that also helps with the plant health as well. So the overall purpose with pruning is to help balance that plant between, having good fruit quality and also having a nice firm structure. Some more pruning principles to consider. Good pruning practices help promote a nice strong framework of the plant. And as I just said, you can also remove dead and damaged and diseased wood as well. That wood's not going to be productive for you, so it's good to remove that out of the plant. Also, the main reason, a big reason we do this is that it helps open up the canopy to light penetration, and that promotes more fruit production. It allows the plant to carry that fruit prematurely. It can also invigorate new growth in the plant. There are things like rejuvenative pruning. I think Mississippi has a different term for it, renovative pruning or something like that. But you can also help invigorate new growth in the plant. But what's frustrating probably for growers is that it is a bit of an art. The technique and the timing of the pruning is going to depend on your variety and what kind of results you're trying to get as well. So I'm going to talk about some things today that will hopefully you can keep in mind as you go through pruning your blueberries, and hopefully will help make your plant stronger and have better fruit quality. Pruning tools, I just want to talk about those for a moment. So in the picture in the top left there, that's an example of what we use in commercial production for hedging cuts or heading cuts on the side of the plant, where we're trying to cut off the sides of the plant or the top of the plant. Inside that tunnel of that equipment there, it goes over the blueberry plant, and there are mower blades on the left and right hand side. And then at the top of the tunnel, underneath the roof there, is a rooftop shaped, the blades are angled in it to make a rooftop cut. So there's two blades, and I'll show you another photo here in a minute that will illustrate this a little better. But basically you can adjust the shallowness or steepness of that rooftop cut depending on the variety you have and what type of hedging cut you're going for. Or sometimes depending on the variety, you may do a flat top cut, and we'll talk about that in a moment here too. But and of course, we also have pictured the loppers and the hand pruning tools there as well. You want to make sure you select the proper tool for the job, and make sure that the tools are clean. If you send out a crew of people to cane prune or hand prune something, or even if you have someone on the BTS chopper, the lights picture there, if the blades are not sharpened and if there's a lot of debris and the tools aren't clean, then you might as well not even cut. You're probably doing more damage than good in that case. So we want nice clean cuts. Also consider if you're doing hedging cuts or you're doing a cane pruning job. And keep in mind, if you're having to manually cane prune, the longer the handle on those loppers, the more torque you have for making a cleaner cut on those larger canes. So keep the tool clean and keep it clear of debris, and that'll help you make a nice clean cut. Also, you want to maintain and sharpen those. You want to make sure that you properly sharpen the blades, and that will help you, again, get a clean cut. It's important to note that a lot of times on these bypass type shears, you're only supposed to sharpen one blade. So make sure you follow the instructions on your equipment and maintain and sharpen it properly. Disinfection. This is something, of course, us plant pathologists talk about a lot. We don't want the transfer of viruses or disease-causing organisms to occur. We want to limit the possibility of that as much as possible. A question I often get is, how often should we disinfect our pruning tools? I'm really proud of Georgia blueberry growers because a lot of them, they definitely clean and bleach that BTS chopper between fields and in between farms. They're very good about doing that. That's common practice, especially since it's a custom service too. So the company also makes sure they do that for the growers too. But it's something to keep in mind even with the hand pruning tools as well. And I put a couple of recommendations down there in terms of how you can dilute your solutions for disinfection. If you're using the hand pruning tool, of course, ideally we'd like you to disinfect between every plant if you could, but the more frequent the better. If it's every 4 plants, so be it, but the more frequently the better. But you can dilute it in using an alcohol mix, 1 part alcohol to 4 parts water, or a diluted bleach spray solution. You can fix up some spray bottles with a diluted bleach solution in there for your workers and have 1 part bleach to 9 parts water. So that's what it is. Alcohol mix, 1 part to 4 parts water. Diluted bleach spray would be 1 part bleach to 9 parts water. Other considerations, and I know we'll re-loop to some of these as we go through the slides here, but you don't want to prune too early because you don't want to cut out your flower buds. Also, a lot of times for us in Georgia, we're not doing any hedging cuts or hedging until after harvest, of course, and then cane pruning and such we're doing either in the summer or during dormant season. But you don't want to do it too early because you'll take your flower buds or yield out. Don't prune too late. Sometimes we do hedge later on purpose if we're trying to delay harvest and try to avoid some freezes the next year. But at the same time, you may have a new set of buds coming on that plant. So if you wait too late, then you're taking off your bud set. Weather conditions are of consideration as well. You want to avoid pruning in cold weather. So if the temperatures that week in the winter are going to be sub-zero or sub-freezing temperatures, then you're probably going to add more injury than helping. So try to select a moderate temperature time for that. Keep in mind that these pruning cuts are entry wounds for pathogens, and so it takes time for the plant to exude compounds that will help protect and seal that wound and protect it from pathogens. So sometimes we need to help that process along by either a fungicide application, for example, or also just considering the weather conditions in which we cane prune, for example. You may need a fungicide under wetter, more humid conditions. That's usually the case for us in Georgia, probably so in Mississippi. But if you're having a dry winter weather, you may not need a fungicide application. But we've actually done a lot of research here lately in recent years to show that the fungicide application is justified post-hedging for blueberries because we do have that humid weather, and it does help stop the progression of disease, basically. So hedging, I'll talk about southern highbush a little bit, but not too much because, again, I know that's not really what y'all are growing over there. But with our southern highbush blueberry varieties, they're usually hedged every season after every harvest season. There's different considerations for the different cultivars. For example, Star is it's one of our bread and butter southern highbush varieties, but it's kind of phasing out because it's not as machine harvestable. But one thing to keep in mind with that particular variety is that a lot of the fruiting wood is on the sides of the plant. So that's one you may want to do a flat top hedge cut on to make sure you're not cutting off all your nice flower buds on the side of the bush there. Or you may, if you're going to do a rooftop cut, you want to make that rooftop shallow and as wide as possible. So again, you're not cutting down into the sides of that plant. And there's just some guidelines there in terms of plant heights, in terms of if you want 3 feet on the sides of 4 feet peak for high bush, for example, or rabbit eye, you may do 4 feet on the sides or a 5 feet peak there. But for rabbit eye, and Dr. Stafne, I'd be interested to see what his strategy is for Mississippi. But for Georgia, we don't necessarily have to do these hedging cuts, quote unquote, every year. Now, if you've mechanically harvested your rabbit eye and there's a lot of damage in there, you may want to at least hedge it kind of on the shallow side, just tip it, as we say. So sometimes you can do that. Other times you may only hedge your variety every other year. And again, just note where typically the fruiting wood is going to be and try to avoid hedging that. With rabbit eye, we have more flexibility in terms of may not need to do it every year. And rabbit eye is also kind of a little bit more slower growing than the high bush. It doesn't rebound back as quickly. And also our harvest time is later. So I wanted to bring up that actually, in theory, a lot of horticulturalists like for you to have all your hedging done for the summer by July 4th. And for us in Georgia, for rabbit eye, that's very difficult to do because our season may be at the end by July 4th, but we're exhausted and may need a week to recover before we get into a lot of hedging and pruning. But anywho, the sooner the better on that. A couple of good things to point out. They did find in some trial work in Florida that there's more disease in non-pruned control versus pruned treatments. So pruning often helps cut out a lot of disease and you have reduced disease pressure there. Also, they found out regardless of timing of your summer pruning or the intensity of it, that did help reduce leaf disease as well. So definitely some positives there. As you can tell, if you cut out some of that heavy canopy, it would allow more sunlight penetration, more air movement, less disease, that sort of thing. So one thing I want to talk about here was about long shoots and having minimal branching. And the growers in the audience are saying, okay, well, that sounds bad. And yes, I do get calls on this from growers where they may have cut their plants back severely, and then they've really pushed them heavily with fertilizer, and then they get these long springy shoots, and they don't have much branching. So that reduces their yield potential there. So just keep in mind, depending on how early you're hedging or cutting back your plants, you may need to go in there and do a second cut, just to keep the plant stature where you need it to be, and not let it get too much springy shoots, sprawling growth there like that, where you have one long shoot. Or it may be as simple as just pulling back on your fertilizer. If you keep pushing them too hard with the fertilizer, you're going to keep pushing that one branch out further and further north, and then you don't have the proper branching that you're looking for there. So just something to keep in mind. That plant, if you are pretty drastic with your pruning cut, that plant's got a mature root mass there. It can really spring back pretty quickly. So just keep an eye on them when you do that, and make sure you don't push them too heavily with fertilizer if you're really wanting to try to maintain a certain stature, or you may need to go in there with a second cut. That's something we do more so on high bush. For rabbit eye, there's really not time to do a second cut, but just be careful with the fertilizer. You may have to pull back on your fertilizer if you don't want too many of these long shoots. They're nice and strong for fruit quality, but you just won't have enough branching to get the yield where you want it. This is a nice photo from Bill Klein at North Carolina State University. We use these types of tractor-driven apparatuses for loading these pneumatic loppers. You can see the gentleman there is holding a pair of pneumatic loppers attached to an air hose attached to this framework, and it just kind of helps, semi-automate, that you have this moving platform now going through the field, and at least they're not having to carry around this stuff on a backpack or something. They have this apparatus, tractor-driven apparatus, to go with them, and it just kind of helps you, it helps aid the workers as they're trying to cane prune down through the field. So this is a diagram where the diagram on the left is where we're showing a lot of twiggy growth. There's a lot of canes. There's not even foliage on this plant yet, but yet you can see some shading and shadowing. That's something that we don't want. The darker canes there are older and less productive wood. And then but what we want to get to is the diagram on the right, where you have a lot of that twiggy growth removed. You don't have a lot of short stubby growth. You have nice strong shoots, and we're going to talk about weak and strong shoots in a moment. You have nice canopy penetration with the light. You have some separation of the canes. That's what we're shooting for. So here, I'm going to go through a few more photos to kind of illustrate this. So on the photo on the left, you see a lot of short twiggy growth. You want to remove that. And, Bill Klein recommends that the base of the cane, they do a lot of mechanical harvesting as well as we do in Georgia too, but the base of that plant, you want to keep the canes in a 12-inch area. That's suitable for basal pruning, but really 8 inches is ideal. The more narrow you can keep the base of that plant, the better the fish scales around the harvester will go around the base of that plant, and that will help reduce your ground loss as well. But you can also tell in the photo on the right, there's a nice narrow base on that plant from the cane pruning. From removing twiggy growth, there's a lot stronger shoots, and there's a nice big V in the middle of that canopy to allow sunlight penetration. Here are some more photos. This is a nice illustration of the type of cane separation that we want. In the photo on the left, you can see there's a lot of canes and twigs there. And if you imagine that plant full of leaves, you're going to have a lot of shading, and that's going to reduce your productivity of that plant. So we're shooting for the photo on the right, where you have nice cane separation. You've taken out old canes or awkwardly growing canes, and you have your younger canes there, and the sunlight can penetrate all the way down to the base of that plant. And the shoot length is more appropriate for better fruit quality. So if you have a lot of this short stubby growth, it's going to be short and not very supportive of getting all the water and nutrients to the berries to have that nice fruit quality. So that's why you want stronger shoots, and you want them to be a little longer. And cane separation, I have a whole nother talk about horticultural defects in the base of blueberry plants or bark inclusions. And one thing that causes that is if you have a lot of canes of the same diameter and age pushing against each other, they're fighting for dominance, and the wood formation does not form properly at the base of the plant. And that also allows an entry point for pathogens. So you want nice cane separation, and you want a nice rotation of different age and diameters of canes. So this is the diagram I've been wanting to get to kind of illustrate better what I'm saying about the weak shoots versus the strong shoots. So, I mean, we've all been to that blueberry field where they hedge back at the same height every year, and this is the danger you get into. You get those really short, stubby, weak shoots that don't support very good fruit quality, versus the stronger shoot on the right. It's longer, the stem diameter is larger, and you just can get better uptake of nutrient and water to that berry. But this is also another illustration of what the plant may look like before pruning and what it will look like after. So you take out some of those canes. I wanted to mention, I haven't mentioned this yet, when I first started this position in 2013, I was actually told, oh, you don't need to start cane pruning till they're 4 or 5 years old. But really, if you start looking in the scientific literature and in terms of horticultural principles, it really is better for the plant if you start rotating those canes out when they're younger. I'm not saying be real drastic with the pruning, because I'll talk about that in a moment, because that can be a disease issue there. But just get the plant will be more used to the removal of those canes periodically, instead of waiting until it's this huge, mature, several canes. And if you remove one cane, that may not do much good if it's so large and large of a plant that it has so many canes and so heavy of a canopy. If you remove one at that age, that's not going to be enough canes. You're going to need to remove more, and it's going to be a big stress on the plant because it's not used to that cane pruning activity. So if you can start it a little younger, that's better. And I mentioned there dormant blueberry pruning with only younger canes left after pruning. I probably shouldn't state it quite that way. You want different age canes, but what I really mean by that is that you definitely want to remove the oldest canes that are becoming less productive and have been there so long. You definitely want to make sure those are moving out and that you're making room for younger canes. I also wanted to mention, I think it's published here fairly recently. Well, I'll mention that on a separate slide. One moment. Let's talk about spacing for a moment. As you can see in the picture on the left here, those plants are spaced very close apart, and that canopy is very dense. So you want to be wise in the selection of the canes and lateral shoots that you prune, because you want that to lead to a good distribution of fruit on the plant. But what you're really shooting for is kind of on the photo on the right here. There's more space there. There's more space in that canopy, and you don't see that shading out. So the photo on the left, it looks like there's some nice crop load there, but eventually that shading is going to cause low productivity in that plant. And I know in Georgia, you can really see it very distinctly. If you have a row of blueberry plants next to a tree line and it doesn't get the full sun for most of the day, then you will have reduced yield in that part of the field. So we definitely know that light penetration into that canopy is very important. So you want a sufficient number of leaves, of course, for that plant to have appropriate photosynthetic leaf tissue area to get the carbon and nitrogen reserves into that plant that it needs for the winter. But at the same time, you don't want so many leaves and so shaded of a canopy that the fruit are overshaded. You don't get good penetration with your spray program because you have reduced spray coverage, or also it makes the clusters difficult to see, to hand labor, trying to reach those during harvest as well. So this is what I wanted to talk about in terms of, you can see, you can cut your plants back to the base of the plant, and it'll have a mature root system, and they'll start springing up new shoots. You can see on the photo on the right here, this grower realized that these plants were in here in too tight of a spacing, so he cut the middle rows out in these pine bark beds. But you can still see that plant on the left, way too much shading, and actually really he needs the row in between that he cut down to the stump gone, period, to be honest. These are large root masses, and they need space. But what I was going to mention, this is not really you can do this, but I think it was recently published actually in a Mississippi paper by Dr. Stafne, that really if you don't cut all the way down to the base, but just, a feet or two up from the base, that the plants can rebound much sooner with their yield. You're definitely going to take a cut on yield if you cut them all the way down to the base, and it's going to take a longer amount of time to recoup yield loss that way. So I think I think Eric can tell you some tips and tricks around that. Okay, so hedging and pathogens of interest. Of course, the hedging cuts, they create the open wounds. Those can be infection courts for disease. The intensity of that hedging activity, it can cause older canes to become broken. This is another reason why you don't want a lot of old canes in your planting, okay? Because you want some flexibility with that plant. So if you never cane prune and you go through there with this hedging equipment, it is very intense and will cause a lot of those older canes to break, and that'll cause a lot of wounds for pathogen entry. So you want to keep a flexibility to the plant, not only for mechanical harvest, so it can handle the equipment going through there, but also for hedging activity too. So one organismal group I'm studying for my PhD is this fungal complex of Botryosphaeria organisms. It's called Botryosphaeria stem blight. And it's a complex of organisms, Botryosphaeria, Dothidia, Lasiodiplodia theobromai, and Neophysococcum ribes. You may be thinking, oh, we may not have too much Botryosphaeria right now. This has actually become a global emerging threat. This is becoming a big issue in a lot of crops globally, with a lot of increased hot temperatures that we're having in our climates these days. So it can cause systemic branch dieback, and why this is so important, it eventually kills the plant. So it's a lethal disease. It's often associated with wounding and plant stress. So if you overwater, over-fertilize, underwater, under-fertilize, keeping your plant as least amount of stress as possible is the best defense for this disease. And it can be most damaging in younger plantings that are 1 to 2 year old that have been heavily pruned. And they're promoting rapid growth there, and then they push them excessively with fertilizer. That you're really creating an environment for disease there. Another pathogen I want to talk about briefly, and we're getting towards the end of my talk here, but vascular pathogens. I don't know if you've heard about it, but it's a quarantine pathogen, Ralstonia. Somebody has changed the law. It used to be a specific race and biovar of this pathogen that was a quarantine pathogen, and now they've opened it up to really any Ralstonia. Well, Ralstonia is naturally in the soil anyways. It's everywhere. But the one that causes disease in blueberry, they have found it can move quickly from plant to plant on pruning equipment or shears. So again, make sure you disinfect your equipment. And it can also spread easily in water, soil, or infected plant materials. So moving forward in the blueberry industry, we really want to promote good sanitation habits in terms of, wear a plastic boot in that nursery at that farm in Florida before, and then make sure you spray your boots with bleach or take those plastic booties off before you go onto your own farm. Even if you go over to your neighbor's farm, it's probably a good idea to take extra measures at this point, because we have detected Ralstonia in Georgia. It's not a widespread issue or anything like that right now, but it's something we have to be careful of. We don't want it around, and it's a big issue because of USDA and reporting, and it's a quarantine pest. And anyways, you get into those issues where you might have to destroy your field. So I don't take this lightly. Be very wary about your sanitation, and make sure you do good disinfection practices with your pruning and hedging equipment, harvesters, everything all around. And the scary thing about this pathogen is that you may say, well, I don't have any Ralstonia in my field. Well, the healthy plants can be infected with the bacterium. By the way, this is a bacteria, I'm sorry. And those plants can be infected and not even show symptoms. So you could be spreading it from plant to plant with on your pruning shears, your hedging equipment, and not even know it. So I just wanted to, it's not the most positive note to end the talk on, but I just wanted to end with that. Those are a few vascular pathogens I wanted to talk about that we don't want to transmit with pruning equipment and shears and such. So this time I like to take questions.
Thanks, Renee. I appreciate that presentation. And we do have a question, and that is, when pruning in summer or winter, is one type of pruning better for that time of the year than the other, i.e. cane removal in winter, hedging in the summer?
Right. So, of course, the plant pathologist would love for you to only do cane pruning in the winter. Unfortunately, due to increased labor constraints, sometimes growers have to take advantage of labor being present during the summer around the harvest time or right after harvest to go ahead and cane prune at that time. I think it also depends on what you want to do as well. If you're wanting to cane prune and remove that cane and not necessarily have a ton of regrowth per se, I think the dormant season would be the way to go, although you can still get regrowth, of course, once it comes out in the spring. But if you're trying to really rejuvenate and bring up some more new canes, you know, for us in Georgia, we have this long period of post-harvest with the summer and very warm and mild fall and even into winter at times. So there's a long time that you can grow up a completely new cane. So it depends on what you want to do. But yes, I know it's kind of best practice is to do cane pruning in the winter, although for various logistical reasons or depending on what you're trying to do with that plant, you don't always have that option.
Okay, thank you. That I think is the main question for you. We did have one other question. It says, can the PowerPoints be emailed to the participants? And what I'm going to say is, since we're recording this, it will be on YouTube and you can view it later. So I don't know that there's actual need for these presentations to be emailed to you. And sometimes these presentations contain sensitive information, so we don't want to necessarily just send that to everyone if there's data or something that the researcher wishes to protect. So I think what we're going to do is just leave it as a video and that you can go to and see that. I will send out an email letting you know when it's posted and where. All right. Thanks, Renee. Real appreciate that.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, one more question. Do you know the general cost per acre for one of the mechanical pruners you pictured?
I'd have to go back and consult with them. I'm sure it's changed over the years. It depends. I mean, some growers buy their own and have their own because they have so many fields and farms to hedge. Others hire Bennett's Tractor Service out here to do the custom hedging. So I can look up those numbers and send them to Dr. Stafne. He'd be happy to report back.
All right. Thank you very much. Okay, so we should move along to our next talk. And this is Matt Bertucci. He's from the University of Arkansas, and he works with sustainable fruit and vegetable production and weed control. And so today he's going to talk about weed management. And Matt, I'll let you take it from here.
All righty, I appreciate that. Just want to make sure everybody's seeing this presentation, correct? I suppose Dr. Stafne could let me know.
Correct. Yes,
Okay.
we could see it.
Great. Yeah, so I appreciate it. I'm excited about speaking to y'all today. I was trained in vegetable weed science and more of a conventional weed science program looking at evaluating herbicide performance. So this new appointment is looking more at sustainable practices where growers might be organic or certified naturally grown. But I figured for today's presentation, I kind of stuck with more of the conventional recommendations. So we're going to talk about weed management in blueberry production. And then at the very end, I've got just a short one slide discussion about chemical mowing. So kind of managing the vegetation between your rows with chemical applications as opposed to mowing. Here we go. So as far as today's presentation, I'll have a quick introduction as far as why are weeds a problem? How can we understand them a little bit better? Then I'll jump into weed management tips, getting some info about the weed biology, because that will inform our weed management and our integrated pest management of weeds in blueberries. Probably the greatest number of slides in my presentation is discussing herbicide options, but I'm not going to belabor you with each detail because there's a lot of information about soil types, about when it needs to be applied, about what weeds can be controlled. Instead, I'm going to try and guide you through how to look at these guides and decide whether a particular herbicide is appropriate for a given use. And I'm going to give you those resources, show you where you can find those. And then at the very end, like I said, I've got a little bit about that chemical mowing option. So we'll start by thinking to ourselves, why are weeds a problem? So first and foremost, the biggest thing that people are frustrated with weeds is that they're going to reduce the yields of our target crop. So pictured on the right here, this is a watermelon plant. Of course, that's not a blueberry, but it's got weeds of a similar life cycle at the start of the season. And so if you put these plants side by side and allow the season to progress, those weeds are going to grow very aggressively. They're going to compete with our desirable crop for light, for water, and for nutrients. And we're going to see suppressed growth and then decreased productivity of that. And the other thing that weeds can do is they can harbor insects or disease pests. So this is more of a secondary issue with weeds. And what I wanted to point out here is they can either be a host for a particular pest that then, can breed more and more pathogens, or it could just be that excess vegetation around your blueberry canopy can increase moisture on that on the leaf surfaces, and that can create an environment that might favor the development of foliar diseases. So in addition to the direct losses attributed to competition for resources, you might be creating an environment that favors development of other diseases. And then, of course, you might have issues where you slow down harvest or affect your fruit quality because you might not be getting those same quality of fruit coming off of your blueberry bushes. So we're looking at IPM, so Integrated Pest Management is going to use multiple complementary pest management strategies. And it's going to require a working knowledge of that pest biology to really help you decide which management strategies work and which ones to prioritize in your system. And the other thing that you need to be aware of is going to require active scouting and decision-making that's accurate as well. So you need to properly identify your weeds. You need to find them at the life stages when they're vulnerable to control. And then you need to assess whether the cost of management is going to offset the yield loss that you might incur with the presence of a particular weed species or pest. So the first, obviously weeds can be categorized, and I didn't even include this slide, but weeds can be categorized either as grasses or broadleaf weeds. Those are major distinctions. There's a lot of physiological and anatomical differences between those species, but they're pretty straightforward. You can have grasses or you can have broadleaves. But another thing that you can look at is weed biology. And one of the biggest things is the life cycle. And there are three major categories, either annual, biennial, or perennial weeds. And that's just referring to the timeline with which they complete their life cycle of developing from a seed to producing new seeds. So an annual weed is going to germinate from a seed, grow vegetatively, initiate reproduction, and set seed all in 1 year. In the case of winter annuals like henbit, which you see here, That's going to germinate in the fall, grow up a little bit vegetatively in the fall, go dormant in the winter, and then come spring, it will initiate flowering and set its seed. Maybe a little more familiar would be summer annuals. Those come up in the spring from seed. They grow really aggressively vegetatively during the summer months, and then when fall initiates, they'll start flowering. Biennial would take 2 years to complete this life cycle. First year, they're just going to grow vegetatively, really common with the thistles, maybe wild carrot. Their first year of growth is typically this basal rosette where you have flat leaves very close to the ground. And then in their second year of growth is when they're going to initiate reproduction, and they'll bolt with a flower coming up right out of the center of this rosette. With perennial weeds, that means every year they come back from their same root system. So you could have herbaceous perennials like Dallas grass, which is pictured here, that comes back year after year from the same root system. Or you could have woody perennials, which would be something, blueberry would be a great example of a woody perennial plant. And then further distinguishing between perennials, you could have simple perennial weeds, which reproduce exclusively by seed. That means the only way that new weeds are introduced into a site are through seed introduction. Or you could have creeping perennials. So this is yellow nutsedge. It's really a problem in plasticulture systems because it's capable of penetrating through that mulch. And it does reproduce by seed, but more commonly, it reproduces by tubers that are born underneath the soil. And so that would make it a creeping perennial because it has a specialized vegetative structure that allows it to propagate. So other examples of creeping perennial would be things with rhizomes, Johnson grass, Bermuda grass. And these things can be really problematic as they get throughout a site. So I want you to understand the life cycles so that you know when you need to intervene. And the biggest thing to do is with annual weeds, if you can eliminate seed production, you can really get those populations of weeds under control relatively quickly. Of course, there's seeds in the soil that will come back year after year, but if you can prevent the generation of seed, you've done yourself a great service going forward. Now, when we look at integrated pest management, you might have seen IPM or IWM is a little bit more specific for integrated weed management. It's a method of pest management that looks at several different aspects of control. So you could have cultural, mechanical, biological, or chemical control. And each of those are different ways of favoring your crop and preventing those weeds from coming in. So cultural control would be any production practice that favors crop development over weeds. So the use of mulch systems or drip irrigation or amending the environment in some way that favors your crop. Mechanical control is just a physical intervention. Tillage events, mowing, hoeing, hand weeding, flame weeding would be mechanical control. Any physical process to destroy the weed. Biological control, you see that more commonly in entomology. That's where some sort of biological agent reduces the population. The only thing I've ever seen where biological control might be referenced for weed management would be something like grazing beneath the canopy. So I'm going to say biological control is something not to be too concerned with in this scenario. And then the last aspect would be chemical control, where you utilize herbicides for selective control of problematic weed species. So if we envisioned our blueberry field here, we've got our bushes planted here in rows. And of course, we don't just have bare ground. We're going to have grass strips, typically, some sort of wild vegetation or perhaps managed turf between these rows. And we're wanting to make sure that we keep these plants, from being crowded out by weed species. So in our early plantings, we're going to want to keep weeds for the first 2 to 3 years. We're going to want to keep it weed free in 2 to 3 foot strips. And then as the plants mature, maybe you need to widen that strip to be about 4 to 5 feet wide, that you want to keep those weeds back. Now, the first option I think that you would consider would be, I could introduce some sort of barrier to prevent the weeds from growing alongside my crop. So you could introduce landscape fabric or some sort of mulch system. But if you don't have that as an option, or if it's not wide enough and you have some strips that you need to manage alongside your mulch system, you might need to think about some other intervention. And that's where you might consider chemical control. I'll step back one here just to mention tillage has kind of slowed down as a recommendation because we don't want to prune up those roots of our blueberry plants. A lot of shallow roots develop close to the plant. So, that's why chemical control is coming up as the recommendation here. So I want to make sure you know about different resources. So on the left here is the MP44 recommended chemicals for weed and brush control for Arkansas. That's a nice Arkansas specific guide. If you wanted something more regional, because I know we're talking to a lot of Mississippi growers, you might want to look at the 2021 Southeast Regional Blueberry Integrated Pest Management Guide. It's got your fungal recommendations, your insect recommendations, and it also has a lot of recommendations for weeds. Anytime you're doing chemical control, it's going to be your responsibility to read the label. If you look at the bottom of this, they say this is only recommended as a guide. Specific rates and application methods are on the pesticide label, and they're subject to change at any time, blah, blah, blah. It's your responsibility. And I point that out because as I was preparing this presentation, I did see a couple of mistakes. They weren't dramatic mistakes, but there were some mistakes. So be sure that you're getting that label in hand and referencing it. Other things that are always general recommendations, you're going to calibrate your sprayer. You're going to make sure you have good coverage. You're going to shield your plants if you have any sort of materials that could be harmful to your blueberries. And you're going to time your sprays properly and appropriately, whether you have a pre, post, or a pre plus post combination application. So make sure you're scouting and timing it relative to when those weeds are in the field. I'm going to start by making sure that you know where to find the label. So I don't think there's a lot of folks who take their knife and cut the label off and reference this 84-page document off of a 2-gallon jug. Instead, I would hope that most people are making use of technology now. There's CDMS, there's Green Book, or you can have separate printed out materials. But these digital versions are extremely helpful to navigate because there's a lot of information in every herbicide label, and you might just want to jump straight to blueberries. So I'm going to use Chateau as an example. If you were to try and navigate this entire document, there's going to be recommendations for alfalfa, artichoke, asparagus, bushberry, celery, cotton, field corn, garlic, grape, hops, mint, nut, and the list goes on. And you could be inundated with timing for those specific crops and rates for those specific crops. But if you just search blueberry or bushberry or certain key terms, it'll jump straight to that section of the document. So I find the herbicide labels from these databases to be extremely useful because they're digitized. So I recommend making use of those resources. And as I go into these specific herbicides, I'm going to kind of show you what these different production guides have for you. And I want you to understand what pre-emergence herbicides are and some of the key factors for pre-emergent herbicides. And then I'll follow up with post-emergent herbicides after that. But pre-emergence herbicides, they're typically only going to be effective on germinating or very young weed seedlings. So timing is going to be critically important. You're going to have to apply before those weeds emerge in order to achieve any sort of control. A lot of times the saying would be, if you're early, then you're on time. So you want to be ahead of the weeds with this application. And you want to make sure a lot of these herbicides are soil active. So that means that you need to have them activated within 72 hours of application. And activation is the process of moving that herbicide from the soil surface into the soil profile in order to suppress the germination of those weeds. And so that means it's going to require a rainfall or an irrigation event in order to move that herbicide down. And typically, you're not going to be able to rely on pre-emergence herbicides for the course of the season. You can really only expect 2 to 4 months of control, depending on the chemistry and depending on weather conditions. So you might need to have a subsequent application or go in there and intervene in some other way. And also be aware, if you try and cut back rates or use reduced rates, you're going to reduce residual control. If you introduce less of the product, it means it will persist at the effective dose for a shorter period of time. So this is a table. It's very similar to what you're going to see if you go to that Southern Region Small Fruit Consortium IPM guide. In the first column, we have the common name, and underneath it is, the formula, or the active ingredient pounds per acre. So the common name is what the active ingredient is in this particular product. So the trade name is in the second column. So Direx would be the trade name. The active ingredient is Diuron. And then this thing called here, WSSA MOA, that's the mode of action, the group number assigned by the WSSA, the Weed Science Society of America. And it's helpful to know whether they're different from one another, because if you use a bunch of different WSA numbers, that's going to be helpful for preventing development of resistance at your site. And then these comments are extremely helpful, but they're by no means exhaustive. Usually it'll tell you about which weeds are effectively controlled and then specific things to avoid. Don't apply on first year plantings, things of that nature. Now, I warned you that these documents are not binding and that you're responsible to read the label. Diuron is a pre-emergence herbicide. And if you were to look up in that booklet, this is a great example. Diuron was referenced as a WSSA Group 2 herbicide. Not a huge problem for most intents and purposes. But also the Southern Region Small Fruit Consortium Guide says that it's not labeled for Florida, and it is. So if you were a Florida blueberry producer, you might think that this is not an option for you, but it actually is. So that's where you're going to want to reference the materials yourself as part of your own responsibility. If we look at some of the other products, flumioxazin, which might be known as Chateau, that's a group 14 PPO inhibitor. The one thing I wanted to mention with this is dust from treated soil can get on the leaves and cause some symptoms. And that's actually something we see when this is applied on soybeans. When you have really hard rainfall and the soil splashes up after an application with flumioxazin, you can see symptoms on the lower canopy. So it might be that you did everything right with your application, but dust from the soil gets up on your canopy. So something to keep in mind whenever you use that product. Isoxaben would be another pre-emergence herbicide under the trade names Gallery or Trellis. That's good for broadleaf weeds. And what they mention here then is it's a nice product, but it might need to be tank mixed with Arizolan. So we'll get to Arizolan as a pre-emergent product later. And I don't have this in the table, but there's a product called Snapshot, which combines isoxaben and Arizolan in a commercial product. So that might be, you might just prefer to purchase Snapshot rather than buying isoxaben and Arizolan separately. I leave that to your own discretion. Indaziflam is another pre-emergence herbicide. Indaziflam is extremely impressive. It's used in roadsides for vegetation management and vegetation control, and it's known for having very long persistence. That can be a problem if you're trying to introduce new crops. So indaziflam is really not popular in annual production systems because of its long residual activity, but that could work to your benefit if you have long residual control of weeds in your perennial cropping system. So indaziflam's been an impressive product for specific uses. Mesotrione is a bleaching herbicide. One thing I wanted to mention is if you did get this on your crop, you'd see some whitening of your leaves. Nipropamide or Devronol, another pre-emergence herbicide, got some different activities. The thing that is important to note with nipropamide is that it can be or should be cultivated or irrigated to 2 inches within 24 hours of application. So this material really needs to get moved into the soil quickly relative to the others. So just be aware of that. Norflorazone or Solacam. The one thing I wanted to note with this is, that one's not the product. I apologize. Norflorazone is a good option. Arizolan is the other component of Snapshot that could have been utilized. This one's also going to benefit from some sort of tank mix partner. So just be aware, these don't need to be utilized in isolation. They can be tank mixed. I apologize. Rimsulfuron was the product I wanted to mention. Rimsulfuron is great for controlling the sedges, and it doesn't have that same harmful toxicity to the crop that halosulfuron might. But one of the things that I saw, I pulled up the label recently, and rimsulfuron's label is currently only available through April 30th of 2021. So it's good that it's a pre-emergence herbicide. That means it probably should be down before April 30th, but just be aware, this happened in strawberries with clopyralid, that we had a moment where we lost registration for a period of 6 months because no label was available. Simazine is another pre-emergence product. This will have post-emergence activity as well. So we need to be careful we don't harm our crops when we spray simazine. We want to make sure we don't get that on the crop itself. These last two pre-emergence examples are just two examples of PPO inhibitors, sulfentrazone with the trade name Zeus, or sulfentrazone plus carfentrazone, which would be another product called Zeus Prime. This is kind of recognized as a nice, effective product for pre-emergence control of the nut sedge products, or the nut sedge weeds. So purple and yellow nut sedge. Now I'm going to shift gears. I don't have as many options or as many things to discuss with the post-emergence herbicides. I just want to reiterate, post-emergence herbicides are going to kill the weeds that have already emerged. And in this case, coverage is important. Generally, the use of a surfactant is important. We need to remember that it's always easier to control small weeds than it is to control large weeds. We can also consider the fact that you might be able to spot spray, have a banded application, or you might be able to broadcast across the entire site. And be aware that the herbicides might be selective or non-selective. So here's a blackberry plant that's been exposed to a non-selective herbicide that caused some injury. You can see that's not a typical blackberry leaf morphology. That's a dicamba exposure that's caused it to curl up like that. So we're looking at the post-emergence products. We've got carfentrazone. Remember, that was one of the products that was in Zeus. So carfentrazone could be alone under the trade name AIM. Glufosinate could be under the name Rely, Cheetah, Reckon. That's a really common post-emergence product. Be aware, it doesn't really do anything for goosegrass control, and it's more effective, or its effectiveness is reduced when temperatures drop or when weeds are stressed. So, certain conditions might lower the efficacy of this particular product. Glyphosate, that's Roundup. That's a product that's very effective, but it's also systemic. So if you accidentally get it on any part of your blackberry plant, it's possible to cause some major injury to those plants. Halosulfuron, Sandia, another name for this in other systems is Sedgehammer, really the workhorse product for getting at yellow nut sedge. Quinclorac, a post-emergence auxin mimic herbicide, good for certain grass species and a lot of the broadleaves. And then paraquat and diquat are both group 22 herbicides, contact only. So you need to have really good coverage of the weeds in order to kill them. They probably need to be small weeds. And I want to mention that paraquat is a restricted use pesticide, meaning it requires you to be a licensed applicator. Its signal word is danger, poison. And you actually need to go through specific training now if you want to use paraquat on your farm. They've increased the labeling for every container now to say danger, 1 sip can kill, because people weren't convinced when you just called it danger poison. So if you're using paraquat, just be aware there's a lot more restrictions on how to safely use it and safely store it. And we just want all of our applicators to be safe, and want to make sure we do everything properly. So please be aware of that. These are also going to be a little bit more harmful when you have green stems. So new growth is more sensitive to these contact herbicides. Now, these are called post-emergence grass herbicides. If you look, they all have WSSA group 1. That's a very specific pathway that's effective on the grassy weeds. So clethodim, fluazepop, and sethoxydim are great options for suppressing grass growth around our blueberry plants. They probably don't have the same level of injury as some of the previous post-emergence options, but for sure, clethodim can cause some problems if it gets on flowering plants. And anytime you're putting post-emergence products, you don't want to do it over the top of your blueberry canopy anyway. You want to direct it toward the base. So even though these are selective on grass species, we want to be careful about where we apply these products. So to finish up, I just want everyone to know about this demonstration that one of our county agents, Ryan Neal, put together. It's called chemical mowing. So instead of going in there and pushing an implement or riding mower through there, you're instead using some sort of chemical herbicide to suppress the growth of our row middles. So we typically have Bermuda grass between our blueberry plants. That's just what's creeping in across most of our properties. Bahia grass might be more toward the southern part of the state. But what he did in his experiment was treat the middles with, in the spring, when they're actively growing, with a full rate of glyphosate. And he also did a 3/4 rate and a half rate. And what he found was there was definitely a lot of kill in the annual grasses, but the Bermuda grass just kind of turned a little bit brown and slowed down the growth. And it actually reduced the number of times he needed to mow. And so that's great. The idea that you don't need to get in there and mow, especially once the berries start coming on, that means fewer times you need to move through the field so you're not knocking fruits off the plants. And it also is one less activity. So he recommended and did find efficacy with using that chemical mowing. But he did say annual grasses were killed a little bit more harshly than something like Bermuda grass. And Select Max would be another option because of the similar activities to glyphosate. I just want to make sure these are all a bunch of resources that you know about. The Southern Region Small Fruit Consortium guide that I linked or that I mentioned earlier can be found here. University of Arkansas has a really good fruit, vegetable, and nut blog. When you're identifying weeds, Virginia Tech has a really good database with pictures online that you might consider. Here are the links for those different databases for the pesticide labels, the link for the Arkansas MP44. And then I wanted to mention to the University of Arkansas Division of Agriculture Southern Fruitcast that's being led by Aaron Cato and Amanda McWhort. And I know that actually Dr. Stafne was on a recent episode of that. So I encourage y'all to check that out. All the episodes are available online. And with that, I'll open it to any questions. This is just a joke. If this was the only picture I could find of blueberries at home, just what happens when you reuse containers.
Well, thanks, Matt. That was great. Let me check here, see what we got in terms of questions. We had one comment that said, I think you were talking about snapshot, and it says it's, she thinks it's trifluralin that's with isoxaben and not.
Interesting. I apologize. I may have, that may be, I pulled that from the Southern Region Small Fruit Consortium. So I may have just misread that one as well. Let's see. Well, is there any other question in the meantime?
Let's see. There's a comment here, but it's not about herbicides. It's about organic fertilizers for blueberries. I don't know if you have any comment about that or not.
I did pull it up. They're correct about trifluralin, so I'll have to amend that. But I appreciate that comment.
Well, we'll have to let them know at the Small Fruit Consortium that it's incorrect.
That's right. That's my former advisor, Dr. Jennings, too. So I can tease her a little bit. So apologize. The other question?
Yeah, it was not about herbicide, but it was about fertilizer, organic fertilizers for blueberries. And I don't know if you have any comment about that or not, but if you don't, that's.
I don't have a ton of experience with that. I've found a lot of folks just rely on compost tea and compost, and people don't tend to do the organic management in the same like nutrient replacement load. They tend to try and build the soil. So a lot of times organic matter will be put down in excess just with the intent of, I'm building the soil. It's always going to benefit me to keep it building up. So I would assume that people are relying on compost and compost tea. Only thing I would recommend is be really careful about any material you bring in for organic production that it hadn't been treated with something like any of the pasture herbicides. Those can be pretty bad residual activity. I see one more question. Will you comment on the efficacy of glufosinate versus diquat, and also how our pelargonic acid or how that compares? I'll be honest, I hadn't utilized most of these products. Diquat is something I've never applied. I've used paraquat, and I kind of equated those two, but I've not ever evaluated them side by side. Pelargonic acid is something I've not worked with either. I know, that is something that is dose dependent. So it's like high volume, good coverage. I think that's going to be case by case and weed by weed. So I apologize, I don't have a super helpful comment there, but I think you could find toward the end of that, they have a nice table of the efficacy of control for a particular compound versus a particular weed. And you can just kind of cross-reference, like, so my problem weed is goosegrass, and then you can look down at the efficacy of each of the different materials. But I don't have the answer for just how they work for you off the bat.
Okay, great. I also want to mention that Renee added some information in the chat box that you can look at about the pruning, and a link to go to if you want to do that. And then also there's a new Produce Safety Division Outreach Coordinator named Davis Edwards at the Mississippi Department of Ag and Commerce, and his information is also in the chat box. So if you're interested in getting in touch with him about scheduling an on-farm readiness review, or just have any questions about the produce safety rule, his information is there. And let's see. One final question for you, Matt. Why is diquat so dangerous to use?
Well, paraquat would be the one that was exceptionally dangerous. It's an acute toxicity. So that little one sip can kill so pesticides are labeled as restricted use pesticides based on either danger to the environment or danger to the applicators or to the crop. And so the reason paraquat is classified as danger poison is because of the acute toxicity it could expose or it presents to human applicators. Really, really low exposure rates can be lethal. And so I'm not a toxicologist, so I don't know exactly what happens, but the fact that the lethal dose is so low means even accidentally ingesting a small bit of it is really harmful. And so there's actually new laws about the fact that if you have paraquat on your property, it actually needs to be locked in a secondary storage area, in addition to never leaving its original container and all these other restrictions. But you actually need to have it in a secondary locked cabinet so that people don't accidentally ingest it.
All right, excellent. So I think we need to move on to the next speaker, and this is Cheyenne Sloan. She is all the way from the West Coast, Washington State, and she is going to be talking about nitrogen in the soil. And this is I understand that Washington State and Mississippi are very different, but we all use nitrogen in our production. And so I'm going to let Cheyenne talk to you more about that. So go ahead.
Hi, everyone. So like you said, my name is Cheyenne Sloan, and I am all the way up in Washington. I'm a grad student at Washington State University, and I'm working at the research station up in the just about as upper left in the country as you can get. And like he mentioned, I am studying nitrogen mineralization in variable organic matter blueberry soils. And today I have the privilege of talking to you guys about the dirt on nitrogen mineralization and why soil organic matter matters. And before we get started, I wanted to outline what I will be covering today. So we're going to talk about why nitrogen is important, how plants get nitrogen, what is mineralization and soil organic matter, and how to maintain and build soil organic matter. And then I'll finish off on some current research about nitrogen mineralization in variable organic matter blueberry soils. So it's pretty well known that nitrogen fertilizer is important. Part of this is due to the fact that nitrogen is a key component of both DNA and RNA, the basis of all living things. It's also essential in growth and the creation of proteins and chlorophyll. And all of these little red circles over here in the DNA bases and the chlorophyll molecule are nitrogen. So because of this, it is most often the limiting nutrient in any cropping system, including blueberries. This might seem pretty strange, especially since nitrogen is the most abundant element in the atmosphere, comprising of approximately 78% of the Earth's atmosphere. But unless it's a legume, which blueberries aren't, plants can't just take nitrogen from the atmosphere. They have to get it from the soil. So where does the nitrogen come from? This is where the nitrogen cycle comes into play. But before I'm going to dive deeper into this, I want to cover a few important definitions to make sure that we're all on the same page. So the first one is fixation, which is the process by which atmospheric nitrogen is converted to a plant available form of nitrogen. The next definition I want to mention is available, which simply means that it is a form of nitrogen which is easily utilized by plants. And the final definition I want to mention is immobilization, which means that inorganic forms of nitrogen are converted to organic forms of nitrogen, making them unavailable to plants. So this is probably a pretty familiar picture to most of you guys. This is the nitrogen cycle. And as you can see, there's a lot at play. The air contains large quantities of N2 gas, but as mentioned before, that is not directly available to plants. And of the nearly 37,000 tons of atmospheric nitrogen directly above each acre of land, only about 5 pounds of nitrogen are deposited per acre with rain, snow, or lightning each year. But most of the nitrogen used by crops did originate in the atmosphere, and it was retrieved by industrial or biological processes. The nitrogen in the atmosphere is mostly N2, which, as I mentioned before, is not plant available. There are 2 different forms of nitrogen which plants generally take up, nitrate and ammonium. Nitrate is most plants' preferred form of nitrogen, which is generally due to the fact that it is the more abundant form in the soil, but it is also highly susceptible to be taken out of the soil via water. Ammonium is also available to the plants and is a little bit less easily translocated through the soil, so it doesn't move through the soil quite as easily as nitrate does. But both of these forms can be fixed industrially through the Haber-Bosch process, which is nearly how all artificial fertilizer is made, or it can be fixed biologically through the process of mineralization. And I don't know if I mentioned this, but plants can take up both nitrate and ammonium fine. Like I said, it just takes up nitrate usually more easily because it's more available. But blueberries are a strange plant as they actually prefer ammonium. So now that we know most plants need a little help in order to get nitrogen, what exactly is mineralization and what does soil organic matter have to do with it? So the dictionary definition of mineralization is to convert to a mineral substance. In soil, that means it's taking nitrogen, which is not readily available to plants, and converting it to a form that is able to be taken up by plants. Here's a little animation that I made that is a very simplified visualization of mineralization. So over here is a soil microbe, and they're going to go feast on some tasty soil organic matter over there, which is the soil organic matter. And then once they've done that, as they go about their little microbe life, they release nitrate and ammonium by either excreting it or when they die. Mineralization increases the bioavailability of key nutrients that were in the decomposing organic compounds, like nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Whether the decomposition of an organic compound will result in mineralization or immobilization, so whether the plant can eat it, can take it up or not, in the decomposer is dependent on its concentration in proportion to that in the carbon in the organic matter. So if there's too much carbon, it's not gonna you're not gonna get the nitrogen, or too much nitrogen, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Generally, if the concentration of a specific element, like nitrogen, exceeds the needs of the decomposer for biosynthesis or storage, then it will mineralize. So to put it a little bit more simply, mineralization is the process by which microbes decompose organic matter in the soil and make the components of the organic matter plant available. During the growing season, with the proper temperature and soil moisture, soil organic matter can provide a significant amount of nitrogen through this process of mineralization. But wait, what is soil organic matter? And why is it important? So soil organic matter is the fraction of the soil that is made up of plant or animal tissues in various stages of decomposition. Most productive agricultural land in the United States has between 3 to 6% soil organic matter. In Mississippi, the range is a little bit lower at 0.5 to 2%. And while I wasn't able to find an average soil organic matter range for Washington where I am, but for example, there's places up here in the upper left, upper northwest corner that can vary anywhere from 3 to 38% to 28%. So to give you a little visual on how soil organic matter can affect the soil, these pictures on the right show a soil with around 3% soil organic matter on the top and then 28% soil organic matter on the bottom. This should say 28%, I apologize. So soil organic matter is made up of 3 different components: plant residues and living microbial biomass, active soil organic matter, which is active soil organic matter, which is known as detritus, and stable soil organic matter, which is known as humus. Having all of these different components is important in maintaining a healthy soil that can provide for your plants. Soil organic matter has a plethora of benefits besides just the plant nutrition part. It also makes your soil much more resistant to changes and just resilient. So there are numerous benefits of soil organic matter. Physical benefits include enhancement of aggregate stability, the improvement of water filtration, infiltration and soil aeration, runoff reduction, increased water holding capacity, clay soils that are less sticky, reduce surface crusting, and these can all be especially beneficial for places like Mississippi, where you guys can get huge rain events that can cause a lot of soil loss, runoff, and puddles, all of which are less than ideal. So I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into these 2 specific physical soil properties because I think it will be of great interest, especially in Mississippi. So a soil aggregate is many individual soil particles that are bound or glued together. How well these aggregates hold up to disruptive forces like tillage or erosion will tell us how stable that aggregate is. And so when these disruptive events occur, if soil particles stay bound together, the more stable the soil aggregate is, the better. In low aggregate stability soils, soil particles break away from each other when water enters into an aggregate. But soils with good aggregate stability can also help in root development, which helps the plants take up more water and nutrients. And then the soil is also more resistant to erosion. So big rain events, less erosion, always great. Additionally, water infiltration is improved with soil organic matter. So soil temporarily stores water, making it available for root uptake and plant growth and habitat for soil organisms. When water is supplied at a rate that is greater than the soil's infiltration, it can move down slope as runoff and cause erosion. And then when runoff occurs, it takes your soil away in erosion. Some additional benefits of soil organic matter are chemical benefits. So 2 chemical benefits include increasing the soil's cation exchange capacity, which is the soil's ability to hold onto and supply essential nutrients like magnesium, potassium, and calcium. It also improves buffering capacity, which is the ability of a soil to resist pH change, which is especially important in blueberries, which we know thrive at such a low pH. It also helps accelerate decomposition of soil minerals over time, which makes the nutrients in the minerals plant available. Some biological benefits include providing food for the living organisms in the soil, which in turn helps enhance soil microbial biodiversity and activity. So this can ultimately help in the suppression of diseases and pests, and also having good biological activity can help enhance physical properties in the soil because it can enhance pore space through the soil microorganisms moving through the soil, as well as increasing aggregates because the exudates of the microorganisms kind of help as the glue that bring all the soil particles together. And all of these can help increase infiltration and help reduce runoff. So I know there isn't a lot of soil organic matter in Mississippi, but what if you only have 1% soil organic matter naturally occurring in your field? Never fret. There are a lot of ways that you can build your soil organic matter or help make sure that you don't lose what you already have. So in order to help maintain your soil organic matter, you have to slow down decomposition rates and increase carbon inputs. Generally, in blueberry systems, you don't do a lot of the things that decompose soil organic matter, like tilling and leaving soil fallow for a season. So you'll want to make sure that you have good coverage on your alleyways, and you'll also want to make sure that your carbon inputs are greater than your carbon outputs. So you can do this by leaving behind plant residue or adding manure and compost to your plant maintenance plans. So as I mentioned earlier, building soil organic matter really comes down to just putting in more carbon than you take out. The easiest way to do this is to leave plant residues behind and to add manure. You have to be careful about what kinds of manure you add though, as they can alter the pH of the soil and can cause damage to plants if applied too closely to the crowns. Here are a few common different kinds of manure that you might find and their pH/nitrogen content / their soil organic matter building quality. I know that manure can be a bit of a hard amendment to incorporate, especially in fresh market situations like blueberries. And if you don't want to apply manure in the off season, like when food safety is less of a concern, there are other options like just using plant compost and treated manures if regular manure isn't the way you want to go, but you still want help building soil organic matter. So to finish off my presentation, I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about my research project and some pretty cool preliminary findings that we have. You might not know this, but blueberries are a pretty big deal in Washington. Up here, we grow primarily northern highbush blueberries. And this map shows blueberry acres per county. Washington State is a leader in the country with northern highbush blueberry production with over 14,000 acres harvested in 2018. This dark blue county up in the corner here is Whatcom County, where most of the highbush blueberries are grown. In Western Washington, blueberries are often grown in soils with a naturally high amount of soil organic matter, with some soils having nearly 40% soil organic matter. And like we talked about earlier, soil organic matter ultimately contributes to plant available nitrogen in the soil through mineralization. But currently, it's not really well understood how much is contributed and when it is contributed during the season. So since mineralization contributes significant amounts of nitrogen to the soil during the season, our objectives with this experiment that we did for the past couple of summers is to quantify nitrogen mineralization in soils with varying amounts of soil organic matter contents and to evaluate the impact of mineralized nitrogen on optimal nitrogen fertilizer rates. So for our field experiment, we used a randomized complete block design at 4 different sites, and each of our sites were at grower collaborator fields in Whatcom County, the dark blue county I showed you guys before, in established Duke blueberry fields, which is a kind of highbush blueberry, northern highbush blueberry. So these sites were chosen because their fields were the same variety, maturity, and had a pretty wide range of organic matter, which varied from 3 to 28%. At each one of the fields, we applied one of 3 different nitrogen fertilizer rates. So low at 20 pounds of nitrogen per acre, medium at 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre, and high at 80 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Additionally, all of these fields and treatments had additional nitrogen supplemented throughout the growing season through fertigation. So we would say that the medium treatment is what would be considered typical application rate for most highbush blueberry growers in the area, so 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre roughly. And here we have 2 graphs depicting soil nitrate in milligrams per kilogram dry soil from the middle and end of our field experiment. And as you can see, there's a pretty clear trend in both of these. The lower the percent soil organic matter, the less nitrate in the soil. And we see the same trend within sites as well. For the most part, the lower the fertilizer rate, the lower the soil nitrate levels. Another trend that we notice is that soil nitrate levels increase significantly. And while these graphs may look very similar, September actually goes all the way up to nearly 300 milligrams per kilogram dry soil, while July barely gets to 150. That's double. So this suggests that as the season goes on, that quite a bit of nitrate is released. All of our sites were harvested using an over-the-row harvester, and this data shows an average total yield per plot. When comparing fertilizer treatments, site 1 with the lowest soil organic matter at 3% was the only one with treatment effects. The medium end rate had the highest yield, while the high end rate had the lowest. And these results are quite exciting because it suggests that at all of these sites, even the low organic matter one, the low nitrogen rate of 20 pounds of nitrogen an acre would suffice and wouldn't cause a significant difference in yield, despite the 60-pound per acre difference between the 2 treatments. And for pretty much all of our measured parameters besides just yield, we got fairly similar results with very few significant differences. So in our experiment, we did find that nitrogen released from the soil increases with increasing soil organic matter. But the relationship, while significant, is too weak to be useful. And ultimately, our goal is to find something that is very easy for growers to use to adjust their fertilizer rates. And because of this, we are planning to evaluate other easily measurable indicators like mineralizable carbon and hot water extractable organic nitrogen. And since blueberries are a perennial crop and we only have 2 years of data under our belt so far, it's not terribly surprising that we didn't see very many treatment effects. We are continuing this experiment this upcoming summer and are in the process of finalizing some cold hardiness and other data for 2020. I wanted to say thank you because all of this is possible because of our grower collaborators in Washington who let us borrow their fields for the summer. And that's all I have. So thank you all so much for your time. Any questions?
Great, Cheyenne. I really appreciate that. Let me check the questions here. We have a question that says, just curious, what factors contribute to the high levels of soil organic matter in Washington?
So we get a lot of rain up here, but our climate is fairly mild. So soil organic matter decomposes at a much faster rate, like the hotter it is, which is probably part of why Mississippi doesn't tend to have as high of levels as it does up here. And then also where we are is just where a lot of the growers are, there used to be like a much bigger river that went into the ocean. So there's a lot of like sediment and other things like that that were deposited to make it so that it's just really, really organic up there.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it's absolutely true that the hot weather breaks down that organic matter pretty quickly. So a lot of the southern areas of the country have very low percentages of organic matter to work with. So amendment is really important in blueberries for us. So any other questions out there for Cheyenne? If not, I'll let you go. And hold on, I might have one more. What is the recommended rate of nitrogen for blueberries in your area?
Around 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So.
Okay, 50 pounds.
But that's also with an additional like 20 pounds of applied during the summer with fertigation.
Okay, so about 70 total then?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, all right. Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, now the final speaker on our list is Blair Sampson. And
I'm here, Eric.
There he is. Okay, under the name Ross Overstreet.
Oh, I'm Ross. Okay. Well, thanks,
What
Ross.
it says. Okay,
Wow,
so
how'd that happen?
I don't
That
know.
link.
But
I
That
think
link.
it happened when I sent you the link to join this. I think it was obviously my registration link because we were in the same Outcast group earlier.
Do I hit this one?
Okay, so can you share your screen?
Yeah, you have to share screen down here.
I did. It's giving me the share.
There it is.
There it is.
Okay,
I'm beginning. Hopefully everybody can see that.
we can. Go ahead.
I am Dr. Blair Sampson. I'm with the USDA here in Poplarville, Mississippi. And it's great to finally get a chance to speak to all you folks out there. It's been a long time. I hadn't been in the lab for about a year. So I wasn't sure exactly what to talk about today. And I spoke a little bit to Eric, and we decided that I would talk a little bit about spotted wing Drosophila, even though it's really not the season for it. I always wish that these workshops were done in the late winter, early spring, so I could talk a little bit about blueberry gall midge, which is sort of a pest that we should start checking our fields for about this time of year. So just keep your eyes out for that. Some farms are not having problems with gall midge. Others still have it from year to year, but it seems to be less of a problem. It seems like we've got that under pretty good control. But I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing with spotted wing. I'll introduce a little bit about the pest. Talk a little bit about some of the natural enemies that we're finding in Mississippi and Louisiana and Alabama, but primarily Mississippi. Some of the controls, chemical controls available. Some of the potential pitfalls for using chemical controls and what we should look for. And I'll end with some of our research that we're doing with organic controls, since we have fewer organic control options for this particular fly pest. The spotted wing Drosophila is a small vinegar fly. Some people call it a fruit fly. It's not a true fruit fly. It's native to Asia, was imported into the United States probably about 10 years ago. It's kind of a long time now, just seemed like yesterday. It has over 100 reported hosts. Blueberry is one of the hosts that the insect can reproduce on, but only marginally. Blueberry is not a preferred host for the for the blueberry, the spotted wing Drosophila. However, the SWD can do a lot of damage to blueberry because of their instinct. Once they find the blueberries, they instinctively start laying eggs. Even though the eggs don't harbor a lot of larvae and they don't reproduce well in the field, they will still devastate a crop, reducing yields between 20 and 50% on average in fields without any chemical controls. This is sort of the beanbag appearance of a freshly infected blueberry, where the females had inserted the eggs below the fruit surface. Now, these are kind of unusual on the fruit flies in that they prefer to lay their eggs in healthy, intact berries on the bushes, not necessarily rotting fruits that you'd expect from our native fruit flies in your kitchen. And they have adaptations that allow them to do that. And here shows some of the eggs inserted in the skin of a blueberry. Here we see 6. I think this blueberry had about 10 or 12 total eggs. Not all of those eggs will survive. Some won't hatch. Most will, but eventually 1 larva, maybe 2 survive, and they will eat the contents of the blueberry, pretty much all the pulp, and their siblings. So they are facultatively cannibalistic. So they will eat themselves just because they're getting in the way. So blueberries are not a favorite host. The berries are a little bit small for them, but they still do a lot of damage. And here's their more preferred hosts: larger berries with thin skins like strawberries, cherries, and blackberries. Now we do grow blackberries here. We do have native dewberries, which serve as major hosts for them. So the patterns we see here is that infestation occurs in the blackberry season. And then as the blackberry fruit begin to disintegrate from being infested with the flies, they begin migrating to new sources of food, which happens to be mid and late season varieties of blueberry. So when you see SWD, spotted wing Drosophila, in a blueberry field here in southern Mississippi, it tends to be the later varieties that seem to get hit hard during harvest, where things like Climax, Prince, and some of the early southern high bush that are grown are kind of left untouched for the most part. It's because these things are feeding elsewhere, and towards the middle to the end of the season is when they start migrating into our commercial fields. The problem with the SWD is it pretty much survives year round here. It has 13 generations. It doesn't stop breeding even in the winter. It does have a winter form. We have confirmed winter forms in Mississippi where they're more cold hardy. They don't do as much feeding and reproducing, but they do have extended longevities, and they can remain alive for almost 2 to 3 months during the cold weather, enough to get them through. What they're feeding on, I'm not exactly sure. They're probably feeding on their fat reserves, but they're probably finding some opportunistic food sources out there as well. They have 3 larval instars, which are almost impossible to control because they're feeding inside the berry. The eggs are very thin-skinned, unlike other fruit flies. And the reason for that is that they lay the eggs in the fruit where there's a lot of juice and they're protected so they don't dry out. But if the eggs are laid atop the fruit, they normally will die. So that's what we call an unviable egg. And I'll talk a little bit about that, one of our strategies for controlling this pest later on in the talk. So this is what makes it a big problem. From the male, which has 2 spots, 1 spot on each wing. That's why they call it the spotted wing Drosophila. Females lack the spot. But the females do have these really highly toothed ovipositor or egg-laying tube, which our native fruit flies do not possess. So they can't actually cut into healthy, intact fruit, but these critters can. Here's a close-up of it. It's a pretty mean-looking device, and it's very efficient. It's almost like a cookie cutter with teeth, and they can just pierce the flesh, slice it, and then push them apart. They're double-bladed, and they make a perfect little hole where they can insert the egg down into. So we looked at a lot of different varieties of blueberries in the Southeast. This is a horrible looking slide, but I thought I'd present some data here. We got wild blueberries. We've got these are the wild diploid blueberries, the little tiny black ones that nobody wants to eat. We have southern highbush blueberry and rabbit-eye blueberry. The take-home message here is that the fruit flies, the SWD, seem to avoid the native fruits. They can't reproduce well, although they can, but to a very limited amount because they're too small, they're too tart, and the eggs just don't seem to hatch. And if the larvae hatch, they can't complete their development. Southern highbush blueberry seems to be the sweet spot. The skin is just thin enough that these females can lay lots of eggs with multiple optimum hatching. Rabbit-eye blueberries are kind of in between. Now they lay fewer eggs in the rabbit-eye blueberries, but you still get the same number of larvae because the flies are confined by the availability of food in a berry. There's only so much food. Unlike fruit worms, they can't move from fruit to fruit. Once an egg is laid, that berry is its sole source of food until it hatches, pupates, and hatches as an adult. So what we're finding is that blueberries, southern highbush blueberries, can tend to harbor more eggs, but proportionally, both rabbit-eye and southern highbush blueberries can produce roughly the same number of fruit flies in the field. This is the slide that I wasn't going to show it at first, but what this shows you is you have to kill an awful lot of flies to have any effect to stop egg laying. Basically, you'd have to kill 100% of the population to get less than 1 egg per berry. So the females tend to have this behavior of laying 1 egg per fruit, moving on to each egg, spreading their eggs out. But as the population of the fruit flies increase, then you'll have multiple eggs being laid from different females. In really crowded conditions, especially like in greenhouse situations, the fruit flies can lay up to 13, 20 eggs per fruit. But in the field, they tend to lay about 5 eggs per fruit. 1 to 2 eggs is enough to do a lot of damage to a berry. Actually, 1 egg is sufficient to do considerable damage to the berry, enough to reduce the shelf life. Now, most of the berries tend to look good when they only have an egg in them. And many of them, I've had berries come from Oregon, shipped here, and they had spotted wing Drosophila eggs in there, but they were still quite firm. So it all depends on how long they've been on the shelf since the infestation. The longer they go, the more degradation they go, especially when there's no more refrigeration. In Mississippi, we've identified 2 natural enemies. Just like any new pest that comes in from a foreign land, they do tend to get natural enemies attacking them. They may not be as efficient as their native natural enemies, but eventually some of our native fruit fly natural enemies will start to better control populations. This here is a little tiny wasp. We've collected several of them in our traps. And we've had them in our colonies, and they've done very well at parasitizing basically the larvae. And when they pupate, you can see the little developing wasp inside. So this is Leptopolina. It's quite an abundant wasp here. They're mostly on our native fruit flies, but they seem to reproduce well on the southern or on the spotted wing Drosophila. Now they are host specialists. They do specialize on Drosophila. So they do much better on other fruit flies, but they can develop on SWD. And if we can get these things reproducing, we're hoping that we can maybe develop strains that can more effectively control the SWD flies. Here's another native one, Trichoprea. It's another neat little wasp, very similar, except this one parasitizes a wide variety of small flies, including the Drosophila, including SWD. So it's not as effective because it has multiple ranges of hosts, but it is a host generalist. So it tends to reproduce well on a lot of other different fly species. So we can actually raise these a little bit easier. But these guys are quite effective. Again, both of them together will contribute to about 10, 20, and at the most 30% parasitism. So you can lose about 30% of your SWD. Most biological control agents like this will not kill or drive the SWD to extinction. It's not how they work. They always leave sufficient hosts for them to survive on. It's just one component to a much larger community that we can rely on to help control the SWD. And we have to be careful when we apply insecticides that we don't harm these little guys, just like we don't want to harm the natural enemies, the parasitoids of the blueberry gumage. And that's one reason why we've been able to keep that pest under control, because we use good integrated control between the natural enemies of the pest and compatible spraying, responsible spraying of chemical insecticides. We found a new natural enemy of the SWD. It was a total surprise. Colleagues up in Jackson, Mississippi, discovered on figs that a lot of these live SWD weren't moving. They were totally immobilized. And they were still alive, but they looked dead. And what we found out is that they were infected by a disease that is carried by houseflies, Entomoptera musci, which is what they call a zombification virus. We also found female SWDs on the fruits that would not move. They were totally immobile. They were paralyzed, but the male still mated with them. And from what we've read, the males will pick up the spores from mating with the female, and he will eventually die from this fungus. So basically, the life cycle of the fungus is pretty interesting. These small little conidia or spores are produced by conidia, or basically they become infected. The instinct of the fly is to go to a high spot, become immobile, and then the fungus basically controls the fly, makes it go to a high spot. Then it bursts out, produces hyphae and conidiophores, and all these little conidia start to develop in these little fuzzy projections that come out outside the body. The inside is just completely covered in this hyphae and or conidia, or conidiophores. I'm not sure if that's the same thing as a hyphae. I'm not a plant pathologist. And these spores are carried by the wind or rain droplets, and they land on the insect and they penetrate the skin, and then it continues the life cycle. So this happens around in June when the flies are active. Now this fungus is everywhere in nature, so it's understandable, but this is the first confirmed case of this occurring in nature of any disease killing SWD. And we've had some colleagues in Sweden that was managed to get 30% control using this fungus. We don't know how much control we were getting here in Mississippi, but it looked good. I mean, it was good to see this occurring on the figs. I haven't seen it in blueberries yet. It is hard to culture the fungus, but there are ways of reinfecting, getting the fungus from actual living flies, from colonies of houseflies. But the fungus seems to be quite virulent in SWD, and they're probably different strains. This one was probably a more active strain against the pest. So it gives us some hope that the natural enemies, the diseases, and some of the little parasitoid wasps out there are starting to make a dent in the SWD population in Mississippi, at least. And this shows that sort of that life cycle again, how it basically turns the insect into a zombie, where the zombie will eventually die and then spread the spores to other victims below in the canopy. Now, this does much better when it's quite rainy, wet, and humid, which for the past few seasons, we've had very wet weather during harvest, especially around June, and that seems to be optimum conditions for this fungus to grow, especially in areas where there's not a lot of ventilation, where you do have a lot of more mature bushes that are not as well pruned. Fig trees are definitely quite bushy, and that may explain why it was prevalent on these fig bushes in Jackson. So to avoid harming a lot of these beneficials, we have to be very careful. We have to understand their life cycles a little bit better, so we know to optimize the timing of our sprays to make sure they're compatible. For controlling SWD, basically we have 3 classes of pesticides, and just like in the case of herbicides that Matthew spoke about, pesticides, insecticides do follow different what they call IRAC classes, or mode of action classes. We have organophosphate or carbamates, we have pyrethroids, and we have spinosades. Now, pyrethroids are by far the more efficacious control measures for SWD, but we cannot continually using pyrethroids because they are very hard on beneficials. They will alter the ecological community in the blueberry field, leading to secondary pest outbreaks. And I'll discuss a little bit about some of the new pests that are starting to emerge in blueberry fields throughout the Southeast and the East Coast, which may have something to do with our increased spraying of pesticides after the flowering period, especially for SWD and other fruit fly species. Most of these chemicals are chosen because they do have short pre-harvest intervals. We are spraying these for SWD during harvest. In order to maintain the harvesting schedule, the PHIs have to be very short. It is best to spray the entire field. Weekly seems to be best if it's feasible. It may not be a bad idea to spray the woodlawn border. Some work out of Florida has shown that that does help control the flies that are moving into the field. And there's some work, and we've done a little bit of work with adding sugar, 1 to 2 pounds per tank or acre, basically with the chemicals to help increase the residual activity. Basically, the flies will lap it up and get a higher dose of the insecticide and succumb quicker. It has to be reapplied after rainfall. The SWD seem to love the moisture, so they become particularly active after a rainfall event. And just as we've heard about pruning, increased spray coverage by keeping the bush canopies open, which helps with production and fruit set, can also help make it more efficient at controlling SWD with chemicals. So these are some of the chemicals here. I know Eric is filming this talk, so I won't talk a whole bunch about them, but you can see the different IRAC classes, 3A, 1B, and 5. You don't really have to know what those mean. 3A would be calcium channel blockers, and 1B would be acetylcholinease esterase inhibitors. It's basically how the chemical kills the bug. And you want to have different ways of killing the bug so the bug doesn't become resistant. So you have to rotate in these insecticides during the season. It's a good idea to use different IRAC classes anyway, because some of these compounds are only restricted to 2 uses. Two applications per season. So if you're spraying weekly for 4 to 6 or 8 weeks, you're going to have to use more than one product and more than one class of pesticide. There are 2 brigade, delegate or entrust and Pygenic are the 2 OMRI approved products. Entrust, being a spinosad, is somewhat effective, but the residual activity is not as good as the delegate, or the spintor, which are the more conventional applications. So like I said, we do have to conserve both our bees and our natural enemies for pollination, because bees are very important too. Although for SWD control, we're not spraying at a time when there's flowering blueberries. However, there are native plants around that the bumblebees and honeybees rely on, which are also important pollinators of our blueberries in the late winter and early spring. So it's a good idea to still, even though it's SWD, still be prudent to spray when there's less activity of diurnally or daylight active animals like bees or these little parasitoid wasps that I mentioned. Also in the row middles, we've heard a lot of talk about keeping the weeds down in row middles. That could be a good help in terms of reducing the amount of harborage for SWD, as well as for other insects like fruit worms, which have sort of become more of a problem in the past few years. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the more emerging pests to look out for. It doesn't mean our fields have them or you're going to have problems with them. They are known to be minor blueberry pests, but there used to be a time when the gall midge was a minor blueberry pest. However, sometimes something changes, the climate changes, or something in the ecosystem goes out of whack, there's disequilibrium, and these new pests have an outbreak or a secondary outbreak or a surge. And we'll talk a little bit about fruit worms because some people have had problems with those. Cherry fruit worm is one that some growers for a couple of years have had some particularly bad problems with. This thing sort of came out of the blue. Now, it's been around a while in our fields here. Cherry fruit worm, again, like SWD, is not primarily a blueberry pest, but it does fairly well in blueberries. And it is capable of moving between blueberry berries. Now, the eggs are actually laid during the green stage, during pre-harvest. And the larvae, because they're caterpillars, they feed on the green berries, not the ripe berries like SWD, but the green berries. However, the berries continue to develop, and some of them will turn blue and look fine and be harvested with these worms in here. And when the shipments come out of refrigeration or put on trucks and it starts to warm up, the instinct is when these worms reach full maturity, their instinct is to leave the fruit, and they'll crawl out of the fruit and the lugs. And their first instinct is to find places to overwinter. So they will be seen as they're coming out of the lugs at the stations or wherever they're being sold, and they'll even appear in clamshells. I mean, so they can be a terrible contaminant in the berries and lead to entire rejections of entire shipments. There is no tolerance for this pest. It's apparently, if you have just a few larvae out of 1 million berries, they reject the whole shipment. They are easily controlled. They're the same control measures for cranberry fruit worm is very effective against these. Scouting for these in the field are more difficult. It is really hard to see these berries because they don't clump them up in silk. They will join them with tiny bits of silk, and the hole is hidden in between two berries tightly sewn together. So it's sometimes hard to see it. With cranberry fruit worm, you can really see those 4 berries all clustered up with dead leaves all around it and frass all over the place. The frass in here, the insect poop, stays inside the berries, so you never see it. So it's much harder to scout for these. Normally, they're not a problem. They are a very minor issue. However, if you have unusually mild winters or you have something out of whack, they do have little parasitoid wasps that are very effective at killing 80% of them. If something happens to those wasps, then they will become a big problem. Pruning too also adds harborage for them. So when they go to pupate, they want to be in a little dead stem to spend the winter. Cranberry fruit worms, they spend their winter on the ground in the leaf litter. So here's cranberry fruit worm, very similar moth, different family, somewhat similar behavior. Of course, you can see this much more clearly when you scout the berries. Now, the key that you might have either cranberry fruit worm or cherry fruit worm in your fields is if you have a lot of green or white berries, but then all of a sudden in the cluster, you have a small blueberry, a small prematurely blue berry. A lot of these blueberries will prematurely turn blue as a response, stress response to infestation by an insect. So they'll produce a lot of these compounds that give color. So that's usually an indication you might have some infestations going on in your field. So it's important to look for those very early berries that suddenly turn blue and there's nothing else around there that's blue. It will be premature. They usually feed in the middle, usually in April, May, but by harvest time, they're already completed their development. There's nothing you can do. There are a lot of different compounds. Spintor is very effective. If you get it early enough, some of the organic BTs are very effective at controlling these moth caterpillars. But once they get in the berries, they're almost impossible to control. Blueberry maggot, it's been around in Mississippi for a while. It's not a problem now. I've only seen it in berries in basically late fall. They're active in June on the wild huckleberries, the dareberry and the sparkleberry. They don't seem to harm southern highbush or rabbit-eye blueberries. However, there have been reports of infestations in Florida and southeast Georgia with blueberry maggot fly. So they could be making the transition to some of our southern blueberries. For now, we've been pretty safe. But this particular group of flies are notorious for switching hosts. The blueberry maggot fly used to be called the apple maggot, and it made a host switch to blueberries maybe about a century ago. Now we have two. We have the apple maggot, now the blueberry maggot. So we have to just keep an eye on it, especially as we spray compounds, chemicals for SWD, that we don't unintentionally wipe out natural enemies that might be keeping this pest under control. And there is a small wasp species that does attack these fruit flies. Now, this is a true fruit fly, a tifridid fly. So we have to keep an eye on this. Now, this is just as bad as SWD. Because of the SWD spraying up north in Michigan and that, they've actually collaterally controlled this pest. They've always controlled for blueberry maggot. By spraying for blueberry maggot, they've actually kept SWD populations down. So SWD was not a big issue for them because they were already using large amounts of pesticides. But using pesticides during harvest here in Mississippi is new for us. And we've already had a lot of experience with problems with using chemicals in the fall, especially with selling our berries, because some of these compounds have very strong odors, especially malathion. But there are some low odor formulations that are more pleasing to buyers, so it doesn't turn customers off. Like malathion 8F doesn't stink as much as 57EC does. So blueberry leaf miner is not a problem. I've seen it further north. These are the tentiform leaf miners. These are the ones that produce little teepees. They fold a leaf over. There's two flights, one in April and May and one further on in the summer in July. They're not a real issue for our farmers here, and they're definitely not a harvest problem. It's just that during the harvest time, if you're using mechanical harvesters, you might get a lot of this material in with amongst the berries. And that could actually increase the amount of these in the field. If the populations get too high in the field, they do tend to stress the plants out, and they can do a lot of harm to the berries. You can have whole fields just turn brown with this particular pest. But we hadn't seen that here, just something to be on the lookout for. It is in the southern parts of the United States. It's just not become a big issue here, but because we are spraying during harvest time, we'll keep an eye out for these critters. I want to talk a little bit about some work we're doing with insecticides. I know my time is up, but I'm going to talk a little bit about Truvia, which is that sweetener, artificial sweetener we've been testing, Grandivo, which is a bacterial insecticide, and Xeritol, which is actually a disinfestant, or it's just a way of keeping your fruit clean. It's basically peroxide. So it's kind of like stuff you would use to kill COVID with. So I wanted to put this slide in here because I like color. And this shows you that we've been spraying these different compounds, testing them against SWD. This here is how the insects respond to feeding or being exposed to water, the control. But you can see that the genes are being altered in many ways by these products. So we are having an effect on the flies. So we're confident that we can actually harm the flies, and we're stressing them out. A lot of these genes are not producing the enzymes that are necessary to keep these flies functioning. Well, at least we hope. I'm going to talk about Grandivo. Grandivo is a bacterial insecticide. It's a toxin produced by Chromobacterium subsugi. We've been getting good control, 67% in our rabbit-eye blueberry fields, just spraying this on the bushes. The only disadvantage is it leaves kind of a grayish crystalline film, which could be somewhat of a problem during the harvest period. But if we spray this early enough, this could be a good way of keeping the populations of the SWD down. Spraying it in the soil may actually have some effect on other insects, particularly SWD, if any of them are actually in the soil, pupating in the soil, because this is naturally a soil bacterium. This compound is produced by a soil bacterium. It's quite stable in the ground. So it may be effective as a ground drench too, but we've been just using it as a foliar application. It's organic and it does fairly well, but again, you'd still want to control 95% or more of the population. We're getting about 67% control, but we also have parasitoid activity as well that's occurring in some of these fields. So that all adds up to controlling this particular fly pest. Xeritol. Now, Xeritol is a disinfestant. It's basically hydrogen peroxide. It doesn't stay long in the berries, but it's used basically to sanitize your crop. And what it does do to the SWD flies, it seems to alter their behavior. They don't want to lay their eggs on fruit that have been treated with the Xeritol. Now, Xeritol breaks down into basically water over time, so there's no contamination or any issue with safety. But what it does do is it makes the females lay their eggs on top of the fruit, not in the fruit. They will lay some eggs in the fruit, but for the most part, we do get some control with the Xeritol. It's only about 33%, but every little bit helps. And then we started looking at erythritol, and we always had good control, both as a control for adult SWD and for larval SWD, at least the early stage larvae. And it may even affect the eggs that are laid in the fruit. We want to try to find cheaper alternatives. And so we tried 3 different kinds in the same class. And we found that pentaerythritol, which is very cheap, about 15 times cheaper than erythritol, that we still get good SWD control with it, but it's not as effective against larvae, but it is very effective against adults. So by mixing these 2 together, we could get good control of SWD. Now, how does it control SWD? Well, the interesting is, what we found is what it does do, it reduces the reproductive rate of the flies. It kills the SWD, but it also reduces the reproductive rate, the number being produced and the number of babies being laid. So there's something going on here. And so we did some molecular analysis work, and we found that we may know what the mode of action is. We still have to do some more work. And I'm going to end with this slide. And what was really intriguing here, this is some work that Ibrahim and I worked on, along with some students, particularly Charles Moss from North Carolina State University. As we expected, when we looked at the genes responsible for metabolism in the fly, the genes responsible for reproduction, the fertility, the egg integrity, and sperm production in the males are not only are they reduced, they're completely turned off. The flies are not producing the enzymes that are necessary to basically keep them fertile. So other scientists have started seeing this behavior. They weren't sure how it was working, why it was sterilizing the flies. But this erythritol, basically this sweetener, sugar sweetener, does seem to sterilize the flies. And they lap it up like it's sugar, even though it doesn't have any calorie values to us or to the flies, it still tastes very sweet to them. Fruit flies, including SWD, have very similar taste receptors as humans. So we may have an organic method to that we could mix this compound with other chemicals to do sort of a double whammy, and kind of not only kill the SWD adults, but also sterilize those that actually or survive to reproduce. So we're hoping that we can make some combination chemicals. And we're working with two companies, one out of Canada and the other out of Hawaii and Delaware. They're based in two areas, working on possible commercialization of these products and working on some other biopesticides as well. So anyway, with that, I will end my talk. I know I've gone over a little bit, but I'd be happy to entertain any questions. Hey, Eric.
Yeah, thanks, Blair. Very interesting, and I'm glad you went over a lot of these things. So it's a good review of some of these.
I hadn't had a chance to do as much research as I'd want this year, but we were able to finish up a little bit. So I thought I'd present some of this data. I know it's kind of new. I don't think I've ever covered it before.
Okay,
but
sounds good. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to launch this poll, and so you can just give us a little bit of feedback of what you want to see. So I'm going to launch this. Okay, and now you have time to go through it. There's just 3 questions, and this will help us get some feedback, and so we can report this back for next year. While we're doing that, Blair, there's a couple of questions, and
sure.
One of these is the Drosophila orange color as it's, and will you see them buzzing around fruit?
Yes, they're hard to see. I'm an entomologist, so I've kind of got good eyes, so I can see them, but they are kind of hard to see when they're flying around. So it's not something you're going to really readily see like you would bees or anything. So traps are the best way of confirming their presence, putting out these vinegar traps. And there are much better traps out there now that can actually really dampen their numbers in the fields. So, but traps are still the best way to confirm them.
Okay. There's a question about the wasp families of those parasitic wasps. You know which families those are in?
Yeah, the Trichoprea is in the family Diapriidae. That's a proctotrupoid wasp. Diapriidae, I see, Diapriidae, but Diapriidae. And the I'm trying to remember, Leptopolina is in the Proctotrupidae. I'm trying to think. Don't ask me to spell these.
No, you don't have to spell them. That's okay.
But Leptopolina bling. But they're in a group of wasps that are kind of unusual in that the first instars are cannibalistic, and they basically will eat their not only the host from the inside out, but they'll also eat their siblings. So there's only one that usually survives to kill the host. So, but yeah, it's a pretty evil looking little creature. That's where they got the idea for the Alien in the Alien movies, was from these little critters.
Okay. So here's another one about, are you going to do any more extensive statewide survey for that zombie fungus on the SWD?
I would love to, as soon as I can get back in the lab. But yes, we definitely want to be able to do that, especially if the seasons are particularly wet. but definitely we want to do some more work with that. It's everywhere,
Mhm.
and we can produce it on house flies and expose the flies to house flies. But growing it on dishes, petri dishes, and that's very tough. I know Dr. Smith and Melinda worked really hard on that. I think they got something to grow, but I'm not sure. But we do have some cooperators in Connecticut who work with this particular group, the Entomophora,
Mhm.
and they can grow them to some extent. And the folks in Sweden definitely have a good system for raising them on host flies. So
Okay, one last question here is those parasitoid wasps, is there interest in commercializing that for biological control on SWD?
there is a lot, and I know I didn't talk about this, but there are colleagues with the USDA both in Switzerland and France. France, they have a lab there. They have teams that have gone out to Southeast Asia and to Asia and China, sampling for the natural enemies of the SWD in their native homeland. And what they were able to, they've got them in quarantine now, so hopefully there will be some very efficient parasitoids available, hopefully commercially, for controlling this pest. There's another species that's not here in Mississippi called Pachycropoideus. I think that's a pteromalid fly or a pteromalid wasp. And I think it's found out west, kind of in Washington, California. And that seems to be quite effective at controlling SWD as well. So there are other native natural enemies. I hadn't been able to find that wasp here yet, but there may be other natural enemies that we don't know about yet. So.
All right, great. Thank you for your contribution here, Blair. And thanks to all of our speakers. And I'm going to stop recording this now. And I appreciate all the input and the attendance of everyone who came in. And hopefully we'll see you again in person real soon. And if not, we'll have another one of these to go and do. So thanks again.